again, my name is Bryn. I am super excited to be here with you all today. I'm going to be talking definitely about mental health, but I'm really going to try and talk a little bit more generally too to give you a background on what I do, what are the different technologies that my lab really explores, how did I get here standing in front of you, speaking to you all today, and what do I think some key things that I've learned that maybe you can take little snippets from or learn or digest for yourself. That's really my goal. So if at any point that you have any questions or clarifying thoughts or want to speak up with a thought, I really want this to be more of a dialogue, more of a discussion, so feel free to raise your hand. If I don't see you right away, feel free to raise it even higher. Sometimes I get into a little bit of a flow just because I love what I do, and I love telling people about it because I think it's really, really cool work that people can get involved in. So do raise your hand, ask any questions. I'm here to help with that. So again, my name is Bryn, and today I'm going to be discussing digital phenotyping of childhood mental health disorders. But first, before we go into that, I really want to talk about how I got here, who I am, what do I do on my day-to-day, and how did that bring me to speaking to you. So as you can see, I've got a couple of titles. I think titles are a little bit silly sometimes because it doesn't really encompass what you do and what you're passionate about. It doesn't really identify, here are the teams that I'm working with just because they're doing cool work. And so I think that's kind of a fun thing that I found myself in, is I found a lot of teams that do a lot of really cool different work. And they all deploy very similar techniques of data science, digital phenotyping, which I'll go into in a moment, coding, and really looking at what are these huge depths of data that we have access to now, and how can we use that for the betterment of human lives, for animal lives, for community? How can we use that really to live better, stronger, and happier? And so first, I'll kind of talk a little bit about my work at University of Vermont. As Emily mentioned, I am currently there. I live in Burlington, so it's only about an hour drive for me to get here today. I'm a PhD candidate there in the Complex Systems and Data Science program. And really what that means is we like to call it the PhD program for the study of interesting things. It's a very, very broad degree that really just deploys the techniques in data science and physics and math to look at really complex problems that don't necessarily just have that one straight answer. Sometimes they have a lot of different answers. Sometimes you have to build a model just to try and understand what you're looking at. Some examples that I don't necessarily work with, but other people in my degree work with, is social media. And how do you look at the networks that are kind of brewing on social media to understand information flow or dynamics of information flow or misinformation, which I think is really interesting. I don't do that, but I think their work is really interesting. A lot of other people on my team look at environmental science and how we can look at how climate change is occurring, look for different ways that we might intervene on systems that are causing climate change to proliferate faster, and really identify things that we can do in real time to make change. And that's what I think is really fun about my degree and about other people in my degree's work. We really just are doers, which is kind of fun. Maybe some of you can relate to that as well. I also do some really cool work that I won't super be diving into today, but if you have any questions about it, I'm happy to answer any questions. There'll be a QR code on the last slide that has my email and also some publications, and you'll be able to read in if you want. But I do some work also in the infectious disease space. Once you're in the health space and you do data science, you're going to find yourself with a lot of different data sets, and maybe each of you aren't thinking about data science, but you're definitely contributing to or thinking about a lot of the data that comes in everyday lives. Maybe some of you have a Fitbit, maybe some of you have some sort of wearable. And if you don't have that, you're contributing to social media, you're online. There's a lot of data sources flowing around, and that has a lot of implications not only on mental health, which is my main domain, but also community health and infectious disease health. So I won't super talk about that. Another thing I won't super talk about, but if you're curious about entrepreneurship or how you can translate what you're doing in school into real life settings to affect real life people, feel free to send me an email afterwards or ask some questions about my small company BioBee, which I'm founding based on my dissertation research here at UVM. So that's a lot of kind of the fancier stuff, but I really want to dive into how did I get here? in the beginning, I didn't grow up and have the nice blazer and the shoes and do all the data science work right away. I really started in my pajamas, sitting at my computer. This is me at 3 years old. You can tell I wasn't always super photogenic. I still make that face very often when I'm caught focusing. And so you can see I had a little bit of an older computer. Maybe this is aging me a little bit. But it's still kind of the same premise of just wanting to dive in, wanting to be explorative, wanting to be creative. And I started off with Microsoft Word and just Microsoft Excel and sorting things and alphabetizing the movies in our house. It started really simple, things that I just thought could be fun and could be helpful. And then this love of computers and this love of how we can take this technology and utilize it to become more efficient or more effective really became a hobby for me, which was really, really fun. And then I decided to take it to the next level. I thought, why don't I really look into this in school? And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I knew I had an interest in mental health. My family has a history of being interested in the health space, and I really found my niche within mental health rather than physical health. I think mental health, I don't want to rank the different domains within health, but I think it's really hard to live a good life if you're unhappy or if you've got things that are holding you back. And so I think while physical health is really important, that's one of the reasons why I'm super interested in mental health, because your perspective and your mindset really changes your whole trajectory on how you heal, how you live, and how you communicate with others. So I think that's really important. So that's a little bit about, in the beginning, how it brought me to a schooling environment where I could learn more about it, and really what brought me to my undergrad in Colorado, where I learned a lot about computers and about wearable technology, and I really just wanted to dive in, and that's what I did then was dive right in, and I noticed I loved research. The structured class settings was really helpful for me because I got to learn new content, but I found myself the most intrigued when I could step away from the classroom and just dive in on my own and really get lost in the weeds and not have a specific syllabus that was guiding me or specific action items that a teacher or someone else was expecting of me, but still work well in teams. And that's really where I found myself in research. And that's how I dove into several summer research opportunities as an undergrad. Maybe some of you are considering different summer jobs. Two that I did were called REUs, National Science Foundation Research Experiences for Undergraduates. You don't have to be from a particular university. You don't have to have a specific background. You can just go and apply to these programs, and they're really cool opportunities for you to get hands-on in research. So I know I've been doing a lot of background here, but I think it's good to set the scene and also give little tidbits of what brought me here into my PhD program, and part of that was those research experiences during my undergraduate career. So if you're feeling curious, ask questions, explore, find those opportunities, and I'm happy to discuss those further with you if you're curious about graduate school after this talk or during the Q&A section. So now that we've kind of talked about what got me here, what I'm curious about, what we're going to be talking about today, really setting the tone for our discussion, I really want to take it to the next step, which is talking about what are my main objectives now as a researcher, as an individual, and those can be really pinned down just into three. Kind of crazy. I spent a lot of time throughout the past many years trying to decide what are my things? What do I want to do? What are my objectives as a human right now? How do I want to contribute to this space, to my domain? And it really comes into what is the science? And that is, I want to uncover new trends using biological and behavioral signals. So you can imagine that's environmental sensing, or that's sensors from your wearable on your wrist, or maybe that's from your health records, or maybe that's looking into infectious disease dynamics and tracking contact tracing. I want to take all of this wealth of data that comes from all these different sources and put it together to identify trends that we can't see with the human eye, that we can't quite understand, and then work to understand them, work to understand what are these trends and what's causing them, either through physiology, through community patterns, through communication. How are these trends proliferating, and how can we understand how we can track them, predict that, and then use that to live better lives? So that's really goes down to objective number one. And objective number two is, okay, great, cool findings, that's amazing. We found all these hidden patterns. and then we wrote some research papers about it, and that's excellent, but it's missing that next step. It's missing that way that we translate these ideas, these findings, into the real world, into the classroom, into doctors' offices, into other academic institutions that maybe didn't read the paper but are curious. And that's really what translating it into real world use means to me. It means taking it out of the laboratory, taking it out of the research paper, telling people about it, getting them excited about it, hearing what they have to say, and building on it. That's what makes it exciting. That's what I'm super into. And the third one really relates to that second one of translation. Translation doesn't always mean building a company to sell a product. Sometimes translation means coming here, for example, and talking to really curious individuals like yourselves. Individuals where I was sitting in your shoes just a couple of years ago, still ruminating on what I wanted to do, what I wanted to be my objectives, you might say. And so I think that's something that also brings me a lot of excitement. So that's a lot of background on what we're going to be discussing today. And I'm mostly going to be discussing the first thing as we start out this dialogue. And the first thing on that list was uncovering those new trends. And how do we uncover those new trends, you might ask? And so we use a technique a lot in my lab called digital phenotyping. Digital phenotyping was coined by the Harvard Onella lab, but also by several other individuals in the field. The term kind of percolated up in time as being something that really defines how can we look at all of these data streams, these digital data streams that we're finding, and then kind of categorize them in ways that make sense, but might not be as straightforward as typical phenotyping. And typical phenotypes you might think of as hair color or eye color or things like that. Even another human phenotyping is gait. So how I walk across a room, that's actually an identifiable kind of, there's characteristics about it that are very identifiable and go into gait phenotyping. However, digital phenotyping takes it a step further beyond just eye color and hair color. It takes in these signals from smartphones or wearables, identifies those statistical trends like I was talking about previously, and then identifies similar people based on that. And I say people because typically digital phenotyping is done on humans, but you can also do digital phenotyping on a wide range of things. And once you identify those similar users, you can track outcomes of those similar users. And I know this is a very broad definition now, so I'll show you in just a second how we actually apply this. But first, before we talk about how we apply it, it's really why we should care about this technique. This technique, digital phenotyping, is born of the field of data science and also biomedical engineering and a lot of these other fields that come together in this multidisciplinary technique of digital phenotyping. But why should we care? Why is it a thing? That's a great question. I've thought a lot about that question, and I think it's because of the amount of applications that this technique really applies to. It's allowed me in my career not just to stick in mental health and even childhood mental health. It's allowed me to apply the same exact algorithms, the same exact techniques to look at individuals with preeclampsia, which is a condition that affects a lot of women and unborn children worldwide. When a woman is pregnant and they are talking to their doctor, there are a lot of conditions that can come up, and preeclampsia is one of those conditions that it's one of the leading causes of death for those childbearers and the child themselves. And so by applying the same exact techniques that I look at in childhood mental health, I can also look to identify trends in individuals that might want to become mothers. So I think that's really cool, and that's just one example. And so there's a wide variety of applications. There's also, as I mentioned prior, a wide variety of signal streams. So I see a lot of you taking notes on laptops or iPads or, sending a text on your phone here or there. And it's been a topic of discussion that we've heard a lot about in the past couple of years is data, big data. How are people using big data? How is Facebook using big data? I feel like that's a term I'm almost getting annoyed with at this point. I don't know about you guys, but it really is still truthful. There is so much data. And what are we doing with that? How are we collecting that? How are we ensuring that our own privacy is being maintained with that data? There's so many questions that surround it, but also the underlying question is still there of what do we do with it? And I think that's a really fun question to think about is what do you do with all of this data knowing that you could potentially relate it to all of these different conditions or disorders that affect human lives every single day? And so there's a growing need to use that data to address health concerns, to address ways that we can live better lives. And that's why I think that it's a really cool technology. So now I really want to dive into how I'm applying digital phenotyping, how my team thinks about digital phenotyping, and really what it means for the childhood mental health space. But I think before I do that, it's really important to set the scene. I know that with the pandemic, there's been an increasing dialogue surrounding mental health. Whatever your age group is, whatever your background demographic is, I think that mental health has come up, at least for everyone, if not someone you know, over the past couple of years in some way or another, whether that's loneliness, whether that's anxiety, whether that's depression, whether that's just feeling like you don't know what's really going on and there's a sense of uncertainty. I think behavioral health and mental health is a really important thing to discuss and to be very candid about. One population where mental health is not super discussed or addressed is children under 10. And you might be thinking in your head, wow, that's a really young population to be thinking about. And you're absolutely right. There's a lot of statistics around mental health, but it's shown that typically if a mental health diagnosis is going to become, if there's going to be symptom onset for an individual, 75% of individuals around that, I don't want to just throw out statistics, but you can do a little digging here. About 75% of individuals, if they're going to show symptomology, will show it by their early 20s. And then if you think about a little bit earlier, by adolescent age, 12 to 14, about 50% will start showing symptomology. But what about kiddos younger than that? What about kiddos under 10? And it turns out with an increasing amount of literature starting to go over this population in the last decade or so, that it's actually very common to have those first signs, those first symptoms, that first onset for about 20% of kids, 1 in 5 kiddos, by the time they're within that 4 to 8 years old age range. And so there are a lot of different ways that you can approach trying to affect the mental health space, trying to affect screening, trying to get more screening methods on board. And some individuals and some teams really focus on adolescents, and some really focus on individuals over the age of 20. I find that if I can affect individuals when they're having their first symptom onset, when they have the highest chance of long-term success, that really fills my cup. And that's honestly the main reason why I chose this population. I think there's a lot of different populations you can affect with mental health screening and thinking about mental health. And so if you're not super down for looking at data from kiddos all the time, but you're interested in the space, don't think that this is the only way that you can get involved with it. This is just the population that I really enjoy working with and working on. And so knowing that about 1 in 5 kiddos under 10 have some sort of their first symptom onset during that age range, what does that really mean in terms of implications of not being able to identify them? Well, that takes us first back to how are they identified? I don't know if many of you have memories from when you were 10 or younger, but that's pretty early in your life, so you might not remember. And even systems for triaging and screening for mental health in the past decade have changed. And so they might not be the same as when you were that age. But right now, how they're typically done is a parent will go in for their annual well visits with their young kiddo. And that pediatrician will typically have 15 to 25 minutes with that parent. And that's 25 minutes is the upper range on that. That's a lot of time. Usually it's a lot less than that. And in that annual well visit, that pediatrician is trying to gain a lot of information about the physical well-being about that child, about the mental well-being of that child, about the well-being of that family, and if they're in a safe home environment. So you can imagine there's a lot of things to talk about. And that's a lot to put on a parent and a pediatrician to be asking all of the right questions relating to mental health. But typically, if a parent has some questions or has some concerns, they'll bring it up in that meeting specifically. And that pediatrician might go ahead and refer them to the wait list for an actual diagnosing procedure. Typically, pediatricians or family care providers won't go through that diagnosing procedure. It typically requires an expert, like a child psychiatrist or a child psychologist, to go through that procedure. And I want to make this a little bit interactive now. There's a wait list in Vermont for that diagnosing procedure. Can I get some guesses of how long that wait list is for kids under 10 right now?
A year or more.
A year or more, that's a good guess. Anyone else? 18 months? Okay, we're right in the right time frame. So it's anywhere from 8 to 24 months. 24 months, to do some math here, 12 months in a year, 2 years. That's a really long time for a child under 10. And while some can get in before that, a lot of times that average is around a year. And a year in a child's lifespan for under 10, that's a really long time. So you can see why we might want to come up with other ways that we might be able to identify kiddos other than a parent needing to come forward and put their child on that wait list, which is causing a lot of burdens on our system overarchingly because that wait list is already so long. And so this parent report assessment, let's say you finally get past the waiting list, you're finally in, you're there with a child psychiatrist, you're sitting down. The typical diagnosing procedure happens with a lot of forms, a lot of surveys. The main part is a survey called a CBCL, which I'll talk about in just a little bit. And you don't need to remember CBCL, but you can just remember there's a parent report survey and then really a clinical consensus survey that takes in that parent report and also everything else that clinician is seeing with that child. And so based on those two surveys, we found that there are a lot of problems, not only in that wait list, but also a lot of bias in that parent report. You can imagine if you're a parent and you've got multiple kiddos, you've got a lot on your plate, and they are doing their best. But it's really hard to report on every symptom you're seeing in your child. And so I don't want to come up here and kind of express all of the problems in the system. I want to begin with that and now talk about what does that mean if we try and address this crisis in childhood mental health. So, what are our aims? What are we doing to address these gaps that really speak to an opening or an opportunity within the space to apply more opportunities for screening or for triaging or at looking at behavior and seeing if there are certain things in childhood behavior that we can identify without relying on a parent having to speak on that in isolation? So what we're really trying to do is we're building a data-driven platform based on the child themselves, based on their behaviors, based on their physiology, and then hoping that those biomarkers that we find, those different features and how they turn away from a potential threat or how they play with bubbles even, will give us some signatures that we can help cross-reference with their true underlying psychopathology. And that psychopathology is just their underlying presence of a diagnosis or no diagnosis. So if you hear me say that word, that's what I'm talking about there. And we're really hoping our long-term goal with this is to take this research out of the classroom, out of our papers, and out of even this space and bring it into an actual care setting. That's our whole goal. And so keep that in mind as you listen to our results here of what does that look like and what are some of the challenges that you can predict that we're going through to try and do that translation. So let's get into some of the results. So this work started before I even came into the lab. My two advisors during their PhD were also working on childhood mental health. I found them because I was working on adolescent mental health and stress during my undergraduate and was super intrigued on it. And by adolescent mental health and stress, I was mostly attaching wearable sensors to myself and running around a room to see if I could capture that. That's what I mean by being curious during your undergraduate experience and then building off that to find a lab that can really hone in on that creativity. So this work and this research had already been going on for several years before I came in. It already had about $1.5 million in funding. And over the past 2 years, we've gotten another $500,000 in federal funding that supported this work. It's really expensive to do research. Fortunately, that's not coming out of my pocket or my lab mates' pockets. That's coming out of the government saying, this is really cool work and we should keep moving this forward, which is really exciting. And then we've also been covered in a lot of media outlets because apparently people want to talk about mental health, especially after the pandemic. It's been something that we've been more open to discussing. So that's been really cool as well. In the past 2 years, we've been collecting a whole new data set of kiddos, which has been really, really exciting. We were able to pull kiddos directly from that Vermont wait list and have them paired up with our child psychiatrists on our team so that within 2 weeks of them coming into our study, they were able to get that gold standard diagnosis that they were waiting for on that wait list just by joining our study and helping us out with gathering those metrics on their kiddos, which was really, really cool and awesome work and helped me validate in my brain, even if we found nothing, at least we helped some kids off the wait list, which is a really exciting feat too that you can think of in your own projects, your own research if you're curious about that. So we just assessed in the last 2 years, we collected over 101 kiddos. It's actually 104 kiddos, but only 101 that I'm talking about today. And we had them all between the ages of 4 and 8 years old with a variety of mental health disorders. So you can see this Sankey diagram right here. This is really a breakdown of what this population that I'm talking about for the results today was. So we had a good distribution of males and females. But what's also interesting is a common fact that you may not know, or that I found really interesting when I was learning about childhood mental health, is that symptomology and diagnosis is not always as clear. It's really developing when they're in that age range. So oftentimes they'll show symptoms of multiple disorders, comorbidities as we call it, rather than having just one specific disorder that it's relating to. And I want to make a clarification right now before we go further, is the whole point of my work is not to diagnose children. It's not to put labels on kiddos. It's not to put them into the boxes. I think that's kind of an outdated technique. It's really just to identify kiddos who are struggling, and right now diagnoses and the DSM are the constructs that we have to work within as we continue to progress this space. And so I like to make that caveat very clear, is the whole goal is to not identify kiddos so that we can engage in interventions such as pharmaceutical interventions. It's really how can we identify them so that we can provide the proper interventions, whether that's talk therapy, whether that's education for the parents, whether that's education for the kiddos. There's a lot of different outputs to this kind of work. So what did we do? What does that look like? We developed something called the CHAMP system. Partially because of Champy, we had to just fit our acronym in there because we really wanted it to be called CHAMP for Champy. Doesn't quite, if you see their childhood assessment and management of digital phenotypes, doesn't quite fit the acronym, but at least we have CHAMP. And what this system has and what it encompasses is a mobile app that goes around the child's waist. You can see them. They do wear clothes in our study. This figure doesn't have clothes on it, but they do wear clothes. We've gotten that question before. And they wear a little smartphone right here on the back of their waist, right above their sacrum. We also put a variety of other wearable sensors on them, little stickers that capture their muscle tension, a watch that captures how much they're sweating, how much their heart rate is changing, how much they're moving in different directions. We're capturing a whole variety of signals, and we're having them go through a behavioral assessment. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But I think what's really helpful here, and I touched on it just a second ago, is for every kiddo that we're bringing in for our study, we are doing the gold standard technique for the clinical interview. That includes talking to parents, that includes having that psychiatrist on our team. So it really is interesting in that all the data we can pull, we can immediately cross-reference it with what is the gold standard, what's happening here, which I think is really awesome. And so what is this mood induction assessment that I'm talking about? I've mentioned bubbles, I've mentioned a couple things. What are we having the kiddos do with these wearable sensors on so that we can try and track behavioral abnormalities or similarities? What is this assessment? And so basically we walk them through several different steps. I'll start over here. So it starts with them putting on the wearable sensors. We take the parents into the other room. We get them informed on everything that's going on. And then they do something called the approach task. And just by show of hands, I always do this, and I don't know if this is a good analogy, but basically when you walk home, and you walk in your house and the lights are off and you're putting your keys down and you're like, oh, it's really ominous in here. I'm home alone. It's dark. Is there a mass murderer waiting in my house? I see a few nods of that feeling of there's like a potential threat in this space. And obviously you just have to turn on the lights, pet the dog, you're fine. But it's that potential threat of walking into a dark room and not knowing what's in that space that we're really trying to recapitulate. And so we do the same thing with the child. We have them walk into a room, and for 30 seconds, we lead them towards a tissue box under a blanket, but they're under the impression that something is sleeping right under that blanket. And whether they think it's a bunny or a snake, we don't give them any of those constructs. They could be imagining whatever they want, but their potential threat of something sleeping and us not wanting to wake it up allows us to track how are they approaching a potential threat, how are they responding to us lifting that blanket off of that potential threat, and then how is their body modulating after they realize there was no threat in the first place. And those three sections, that pre-startle, that startle, and that modulation session or that modulation period, is really key points that we're collecting behaviors and movements from these kiddos and can relate that back to their clinical relevance. And so I think that's really interesting that in this 30-second task, we're able to capture these really clinically relevant periods and capture the behaviors happening there. The next thing we do is, I'm sure you've had to do this in class, is stand up and give a speech, kind of like I'm doing right now. We do the same thing with that kiddo under 10. We say, please give us a speech. We're going to stand here and we're going to judge it. And that is a lot of pressure. If someone says, I'm going to judge your speech, and you don't have anything prepared, it's hard to imagine everyone naked when you're also up there naked and scared and nervous and don't know what you're speaking on. Like I said, they're still wearing clothes, but it feels that way. It feels like a vulnerable situation, right? And so then they give their speech, and we process everything in terms of that speech. We process what they're saying, how their voice is changing, what's the pitch, what's the tone, how are they moving, are they fidgeting? You can imagine all of these different signals. Are they producing that sweat in their hands, or are they really activating that trapezius? I don't know if some of you, when you get stressed, you kind of do the shoulder thing. My sister does the shoulder thing all the time. And everyone's got these different stress responses, and that's what we're trying to hit on. The next one is the bubbles task, and you might be able to infer what this one is. For 3 minutes, we just have them play with bubbles, and we really want to see how they respond to that reward of just saying, go play, go have fun, and we play with them. And I can't tell you how many times I've been like a little bug on my back, like poking at bubbles with small kiddos. It's really, really fun. So if you're thinking about research, keep in mind you also get to be very hands-on as well, and sometimes hands-on bubbles, which is really, really cool. And I won't super go into the reward task because we don't use that task as much. And I really want to go into what we found from these different tasks. And so these tables, you don't have to super read them. I'm going to go into the cool parts of these tables in a second. But what I want you to take away is we take in all of this data from all of these different tasks. We take all of these different signals, and these models that we've built right here, how many of you have heard of machine learning? Okay, great. How many of you have heard of predictive modeling? Amazing. Essentially, very, very similar techniques, very similar things. So that's what I'm deploying here, is we've looked at, based on these signals that we're capturing from the kiddos, can we find things that help us predict their underlying diagnosis if we keep away all of that information that we collected from parents on the typical diagnosing procedure? Let's say if we just had these mood induction tasks, could we identify their underlying diagnosis? And what's really, really cool from this work is it turns out if we look at our models, we're capturing about 73% of, our accuracy is about 73. And for anxiety, we're capturing about 70%, and depression, 71%. And you might think to yourself, okay, moderate, that's like a C, if you're thinking in terms of class and in terms of rankings. But now I want you to look at that top diagram there, and that's parent surveys. So if I kind of loop us back, rewind a second, and we think back to the CBCL that I mentioned earlier about how we do those parent report surveys compared to our clinical consensus surveys. So we did a pretty simple analysis where we looked at how often do just the parent report surveys reflect what we see in that clinical consensus. So basically the question, to re-summarize, is how often is a parent properly and accurately reporting the same way that a gold standard clinical diagnosis would? And it turns out that their accuracy for ADHD was about 70%, for depression around 60%, and for anxiety around 80%. And so you can see that it's actually really interesting what we can do in a 10 to 15 minute behavioral assessment period, because we're capturing the same amount of data in that's allowing a parent to also make the same predictions or the same accuracy about their child's symptomology over the last 6 months. And I'll reaffirm here, we're not trying to replace parents. We know parents know their kiddos very, very well, and we hope with these findings that we're not, throwing any parents under the bus or things like that. But it really shows that it's really hard to get an objective measurement of what's going on with your kiddo if you're a parent and you're an outside reporter. Yeah, do you have a question?
I do. So I wonder, while leading these children through these exercises, how much it's considered that the observer is affecting the experiment? Because it's like objective, or is it,
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me try and make sure I understand your question. Are you talking observer as an administrator or parent?
Or someone random.
Yeah.
Either a male or a female, someone with a nice face, someone who's mean, someone who's, all these variables will affect children on a subconscious level and can really affect those results.
Yes, I love that you asked this question, and it goes back to how do we replicate and validate these results, right? How do we make sure that it wasn't just we had a super nice administrator or a really scary administrator or had these RAs that were walking through the protocol? And so what we've done with the CHAMP system is not only create that app and create a website and create an online processing script for all of the code that's needed to collect and process the data, we also created a protocol that walks the administrators through all of these tasks. And obviously in that protocol, we can't say, they should be of XYZ demographic and XYZ height, and all of these different things that you might want to remain consistent. But we do have specific limitations around, you should say this at this time frame, you should have this kind of face on, you should, when you say judge, you should make sure you're not smiling or anything like that. You should have this kind of relative emotional affect. And so we try and control a little bit for that, but that is a really great question. And that's where we're really hoping through releasing this system and having other groups build on it. We've already had 2 other institutions use our same software to collect and validate these different features, that we continue to see results. Like I said, we've been building off our past work and are seeing good things, but that's why we want to release this for that exact question, is how do we show it? How do we prove that this is a thing, Wonderful question. And just like that, if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'd love to answer them. So just to recapitulate here, what I'm trying to show is our models, even though they only have about 70% accuracy on this small data set, and I should clarify, I'm talking about all these different signal streams and things like that. The models that I'm presenting right here actually just come from the smartphone that's around their waist. And so not including any information about their heart rate or how much sweat they're producing or that muscle tension, literally just from the audio signals and from the angular movement and the acceleratory movement captured by that smartphone, we're able to look at accuracy of models very, very similar to parent report, which we were very psyched about because our whole kind of assertion, our whole goal from the system is to create a complementary model to help with parent report, help get a more objective screening that can go alongside parent report. And so taking this to the next level beyond accuracy, I think it's always good to look at what does this actually mean in terms of numbers? And I hate to put up tables on the board, but I think there's a few really cool things that I got out of this that I wanted to share. And that's looking at specifically depression. And so you'll see here in the red, that's the false positive rate. It's essentially when a parent in the uppercase says, I think my individual is struggling with X, Y, and Z, but in actuality, based on clinical consensus, they're not actually struggling, or they're not actually diagnosed, I should say. They may be struggling. And the gold one, or the green one, that's when they've correctly said, I think that something is wrong, and the clinical consensus was like, yes, something is wrong. And so that's the red and the green here. And what I thought was really interesting, in terms of depression, we were able to identify 50% of kiddos saying, we think for sure that something is wrong, and we accurately found them, whereas parents only found about a third of them, a little over a third of them, saying, I think something is wrong and something was actually wrong. And we were actually able to get more specific as well in terms of 9% to 10%, that's around the same ranges. I don't want to say our model is better than parents or things like that. But when you're reflecting on how accurate or how we want to minimize the number of false positives caught in a screening mechanism, we're showing very specific models, especially compared to typical parent report. And again, this is just with a 10 to 15 minute model using just a smartphone, not including all those other modalities that I've been talking about here, which have totally different model results. So does anyone have any questions, or what questions do people have about these models, what we find interesting about them? Any questions about the infrastructure or the predictive modeling? Yeah.
Are you only looking for ADHD, anxiety, and depression? That's kind of like your main
focus? That's a great question. So for these models that I'm showing you here, I'm really focusing on ADHD, anxiety, and depression. I also have a specific interest in PTSD. So while I'm not showing that here, if you're interested in PTSD, we also have some literature that we've released on that. We had a small subset of kiddos just in this last population that we gathered that had PTSD, unfortunately, but also fortunately because we have that data. And so that's really exciting as well. We don't do a lot with autism work. There is a lot of work in the autism space for using objective biomarkers for mental health diagnosis, but not a lot for these other afflictions, so that's why we focus on these. Great question. Yeah?
Are you guys, since you said you're working with a psychiatrist at the same time, are you guys diagnosing and giving meds?
So that's a great question. The first part of that, yes, we are working with a child psychiatrist that's helping us, or child psychologists in our study. Both are qualified to do this examination. And we are giving them follow-up resources and connecting them to the right channels, but we are not doing any sort of prescribing or any sort of pharmaceutical interventions for this work.
I think it's be better for other things to happen than just medicine.
Exactly.
Alternatives.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you feel that way, and all thoughts here presented are my own, and I also feel similarly. I think there are a lot of ways to intervene in early life on mental health, and I don't think that's always pharmaceutical intervention, and that's why if we identify more children, we can test other non-pharmaceutical intervention techniques like CBT and DBT and talk therapy and group therapy, and even just providing education for parents and further testing how that has an influence on their child's behavior without even affecting the child directly. And so that's something my group is also very interested in. That's a great question. Amazing. So I'm going to keep going just a little bit, but if anyone has any additional questions, again, feel free to ask. And so the next way I really wanted to build on this work and to really take it to the next level is, okay, great. So we've shown models that do pretty well compared to gold standard diagnosing for identifying kiddos. But what happens if we want to not only identify kiddos, but also get some sort of measurement of how severe that diagnosis is, or essentially how much are they struggling? And this is a really hard question to address, actually, because that clinical consensus diagnosis does not give a level for severity. We can only give kind of a relative report for severity, and that usually comes from that parent report with those symptoms. And so we use symptom count as kind of a pseudo measurement for severity. And why this is important is because there are a lot of limited resources in childhood mental health and in mental health overarchingly. And obviously we don't want to triage too much in that we leave kiddos that may be struggling and we don't identify them out. But we do want to make sure those kiddos that are really on edge or need that immediate intervention, that we can make sure they get that immediate intervention. And so that's why we're really interested in incorporating severity into our models as well. And I won't super dive into the results here, but what we found is when we looked deeper into these models, we looked deeper into the features that are going into those models. For example, you see one is median AM, which is median angular movement, and so, or median acceleratory movement. And so what that means is what is their average acceleratory movement during the 0 to 15 seconds of bubbles? That's the actual feature right there. How much are they changing in acceleration? And what is the average of that? And so if we think about these features and we dive into those features, we can start to understand how these features then correlate if we aggregate them together and do some transformations on them, some math here and there. I don't want to daunt anyone here that's not a big math person, but it's nothing too crazy, nothing that makes us upset at all. We look at these features, we try and transform them in different ways to see how they can relate or translate or correlate over to our actual diagnosis or level of severity. And to be succinct and to summarize that, we found some really cool things in that we did find that these features that we're predicting in our binary models, and I say binary in terms of it's classifying either a 0 or a 1, diagnosis or no diagnosis, that those same features helped us represent what severity level was as well. So our next steps with that is really diving into that, seeing if we can create a model that can not only do one or the other between our two systems, but combine them in a way that's really helpful and validated across a larger population, which is really our next step. We're gathering new kiddos now down at Wake Forest, which is a school in North Carolina, and they've got a huge hospital network, and so we're gathering a lot of kiddos for our next clinical trial there. So, to recap, I want to leave a lot of time for Q&A because I want to hear what you're curious about and want to really dive into what questions you all have about this work. I know I've dived into a lot of kind of what's digital phenotyping, how do we apply data science to this field, how does it apply to different fields, what is it in terms of this context of childhood mental health screening, and what are our goals with it? What are our next steps? And then really talked about how we want to validate these biomarkers in larger populations with this very specific assessment protocol that we've made to try and see if we can reliably track childhood mental health similar to a longitudinal screening. What my goal from this, to really summarize it, is just like a kiddo when they come into a doctor's office has to get their height checked and their weight checked. And you have all these other measures of how they're doing, and they can quantify that. I'd really love a way to track childhood behavioral health, whether that's a way for longitudinal screening just for the parent, but also as they move into adulthood, having a view of what their behavior was like, how it compared to other kiddos of similar demographics and age ranges or regions or similar backgrounds in terms of trauma or no trauma background. I'm very curious about how those insights can help us better support them in their later lives, even if they're not currently diagnosed now or struggling now, because I think insights at any time is better than no insights at all, which is currently kind of what we're working with. So that's what we've discussed today. That's really the goals. We went through a lot, and I didn't super dive into machine learning or the technologies underlying that. So if you're curious about machine learning or engineering or wearable sensors or how we can work in a very interdisciplinary space, I really opened the floor. Or if you're curious about my trajectory to candidacy in my PhD or how I work these other jobs, what I'm saying is I'm really open to any questions that you have. And if you're shy, that's totally wonderful too. I've put this QR code here. This QR code will take you to the publications from myself and my lab, as well as to my email, my LinkedIn. Feel free to send me a LinkedIn request if you're trying to expand your network. I'm super open to any sort of calls if you have questions. And feel free to also find me on social media as well. I put little tutorials on there. You can find me at Technology Bryn. And if you have a specific thing you're looking for, if you have a club that you want outreach from, this is my spiel saying I'm available for that. So thank you so much for listening. Yeah.
So on my smartwatch, I have an EDA scan.
Yeah.
That when I do is I sit there for 2 minutes and it measures my stress levels. Do you guys have that on the children as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that you're experimenting with it.
Oh, I love my watch.
It's very cool, right? And I think that's a really fun thing about wearables is they can empower you to learn about new modalities, new ways that researchers are tracking different things and really put them in the general public's hands to also play with. And so you're absolutely right. Electrodromal response is what another modality that we use. It's on that watch that I showed you on that larger schematic on the kiddo. And we collect it at a constant rate, so they don't have to be attached to it. We track it all the way through each of the assessments.
Oh, I wish that was on my watch.
Yeah, me too. Eventually those kinds of modalities will hypothetically be available in more consumer wearables, but that's why we use more research grade wearables in our work. But I agree. I wish I had my constant EDA signals, but I'm kind of a nerd with that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So if a child was diagnosed with one of those disorders,
Yeah.
Did the parent go through a similar survey to say that they may or may not have a similar condition?
That's a great question. And while my team didn't fully look into that, it takes a bit of time to allocate to that diagnosing procedure, and we focused a lot on the child. We did do some background questionnaires on if that parent had a history of mental health problems or history within the family of mental health problems or physical problems that might contribute to that diagnosis or contribute to their over-reporting or under-reporting. So we didn't do the full diagnosis screening, but we did do some work in that, and there's a lot of work in the field for looking at how your own background in mental health or mental illness might affect your ability to report for others. So I think it's a really cool space.
Well, can I follow up?
Yeah, please.
So was there correlation or something like apparently or not?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So we did several analyses relating to that parent reporting and how it corresponds to that clinical consensus. And we did find that when we looked at how accurate it was, there was certain backgrounds of that parent that had it more likely to be inaccurate. And one of those was if they had, their own background problems as well, or things that they were also struggling with. And that did not make it as accurate, and for some made it more accurate, because sometimes if you can see it, you're able to identify it better, and sometimes if you're struggling with it, it makes it harder to see. So it's really hard to place the tracker on what direction the bias goes, but we have done some analysis in that area. That's a great question. Okay, what other questions do we have? I can see in the back there. You're not totally dark with the lights. I can see back there if you raise your hand. Yeah.
Have you looked at how having siblings kind of correlates with that? Just because a lot of the time parents don't realize there's something wrong until they have a child who's typical, or kids don't really learn how to play with other kids sometimes, and it'll look like they have something. Have you looked at how that? What are the numbers? Is there a lot of single children or anything?
I love that question. I just had an amazing master's student last year who just defended Anna Jane, who is also in this lab. She is one of my, don't tell my other mentees, she's one of my favorite mentees. And she was also very, very curious about this question of sibling versus if you don't have a sibling, and how that might have similar behavioral patterns or different behavioral patterns, or how a parent might report on that. And so her whole kind of dissertation work, the paper that she wrote, was based on that. And we found some interesting things that we had a few twins in our study as well. Unfortunately, not enough to have super strong, statistical power in our comparisons. But we were surprised for siblings to not find as many behavioral similarities. They seemed pretty behaviorally distinct as well, just as much as two other people. And so we're still diving into that. We're also very curious about that. Another person on our team is particularly interested in sibling ordering. So how does you being a middle child versus a first child versus a third child or a subsequent child or an adoptive child, how does that change your behavior in regards to your other siblings? So very, very cool question. We're also curious. Yeah.
That question made me wonder about environmental factors, single parent household, married household. Do you guys include that in your study?
Yeah. So we do include that in our study. We do a full kind of demographic background on that family and that child, looking into, for example, the income of that family, the education level of that family, where they're coming from geographically. For this sample that I showed you here, this is just from Vermont. So unfortunately, in terms of our diversity in economic levels or in background of geographics or even diversity, we're not super solid in this study, but we do have other samples where we're trying to get more diverse populations, a lot of samples in Michigan as well that are helping us with this work. And so we do look at that and we try and understand how do these different backgrounds, whether that's familial background or the child background through ACEs and things like that, contribute to these models and how we can incorporate that. That's a wonderful question. What other questions do we have? I'm just going to grab some water here. Yeah.
So all the others are wearables that you showed in that diagram. Are the results in the papers and you just sort of pulled out some of the data, or are you still working on that as well?
So we're still working on that. That's my main work, is pulling in all of these different signal streams and trying to identify which is the best of the signal streams. And by best, I mean the most informative, the one that's showing the most signal. Obviously, if we want to translate this into clinical setting, if we have to put 10 wearables on them, that doesn't make it super feasible for clinical settings, right? Especially if we have to use research-grade wearables. And that's why we start with this smartphone analysis to see how much can we do with literally just a phone around their waist, and then build from there. And so we haven't published the results from the other modalities, but if you see in the next 6 months or so, and you keep tabs or you check in another 6 months, I'm happy to provide more of those results. It's very exciting. Yeah.
So at first I was thinking it was like a smartphone-like computer, but is it actually just a smartphone?
It's literally a smartphone. Yes, that's a great question. So she was wondering if it's a smartphone-like computer, if it's literally a smartphone. It's literally a smartphone that we built an app for and just had that app programmed to collect constant audio and collect accelerometry and gyroscope. And that's what these models are based on that I showed you here. And so a smartphone is giving us those accuracies and those true positive and false positive rates.
Is that app the thing that you're a CEO of?
So that's a great question. Yeah. So she asked about how this app relates back to the company BioBee that I earlier referenced. And you're absolutely right. We're translating what we're doing with that app, but really expanding it, adding some new things, kind of adding some additional modalities, including separate wearables and things like that. So you're absolutely right. We're building off that app to make it more of a full screening kind of toolkit, and that's part of the company. Absolutely.
I think that's great. You're really good. I feel like that's really going to become a popular tool to use.
Oh, thank you. I hope so too. She said that it seems like there would be potential in clinical trials, and that's absolutely our hope too, is to see if these pharmaceutical clinical trials are currently also using parent report, even though our goal is not to put more pharmaceuticals in kiddos. But our goal is to make sure we can have more objective measurement-based care. We do want to track these signals and track how different kids are responding to these structured behavioral tasks, and hopefully that can be used in clinical trials, but also in just clinical environments overarchingly for parents, for those managers, for anyone who might want just a few more numbers to track that over time. Yeah.
Me?
Yeah.
So out of the 101 participants, how many were their disorders so severe where you recommended, or your psychiatrist recommended medication?
That's a great question. So our psychologist was very particular not to recommend medication through this study. She referred them to other experts that were able to, once you have a diagnosis, it's a little bit easier to get that follow-up care if you don't have to go through that full screening and diagnosis procedure. And so we weren't doing any sort of referring, but there were some severe kiddos that we did try and follow up with resources. We've just done a one-year study to follow up with those kiddos that were in our study the first year to see how they're doing, see if they took on resources, seeing if being a part of this study helped in any way, especially for accessing resources, or what they did in terms of follow-up after having that insight. So that's a great question.
So just a few were severe.
So we had, if we remember this one, you can kind of see there's, just for ADHD specifically, we had kids ranging from one symptom to the most severe being like 20 symptoms up here. So that's pretty severe ADHD for young children. And so there was definitely some kiddos that were struggling. We did pull particular from the wait list, and if you're on the wait list, that tends to mean that you're struggling with some things. But we did also just pull from convenience sampling in the community and find kiddos that the parent thought something might be up, but we weren't going to do anything, but saw your study and then were able to help find those resources earlier on. So that was really exciting. What other questions do we have? Yeah.
So, not knowing much about machine learning, so I know you mentioned you are recruiting in other states and things, so do you have a sense of how many kids you're going to have to do this with to get to a sense where you feel like you're sort of, I don't know what the right terminology is, like saturated in terms of like this is as good as it's going accuracy as we can get? Do you have a sense of how many people that is, or you'll develop that over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of it is definitely the latter of we just have to keep developing over time. I think as populations evolve, as communities evolve, even if this system does end up hitting the goal and going into clinical practice, I think we'd still want the models constantly being trained, constantly being tuned, because of the changing environment, changing behavioral patterns, things like that. Behavioral patterns are very much an artifact of your community, of everyday life, of how things are changing. And so in terms of what the perfect end would be, I think just enough that we feel really confident we can run statistical tests that there's no kind of confounding things due to these barriers of demographics not being represented or things like that. So that's a good question. I don't know. Hopefully I'll see that soon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any other curiosities? Any other?
Do you have children?
Do I have children?
Yeah.
No, I don't have kiddos. I like to just work with the kiddos in the study. I don't have kids of my own.
Do anybody on your team has children?
Yes.
The reason I asked is because I feel like raising young kids, single digits, is like a bipolar roller coaster ride, day to day, and it's like we work through all of those conditions almost every day, trying to help them find baseline.
Yeah.
And I don't know, what's the perspective if it's actually just typical childhood behavior, and it's actually the parent or the guardian that's deciding how well they can adapt to their environment.
Yeah, that's a great question. Two of the main contributors, two of the main advisors on this team do have young kiddos.
Yeah.
And so part of our whole mission of what we do is not only to disseminate our scientific results, but also we've created a parent resource hub. And our whole goal with that is even if your child is not diagnosed or at clinical level, what are some of the typical behaviors we're seeing in our study? What are some different resources you can access? What are some books you can read? We really want to extend past just diagnosing, screening, triaging, and really being that support for parents. That's the whole goal. Right now, I can imagine it would feel very isolating to raise a young kiddo where they're constantly going back and forth and you don't know what behavior is normal or what everyone else is experiencing. And so that's a great question of like how do we balance the information with just being a resource itself as well. If that answered your question. And if it did, please dive further.
I mean, what is typical and what is atypical?
Yeah.
Isn't that what diagnosis is all about, right?
Right.
We have to have a standard, and maybe it changes over time, but it does somewhere to start.
Right. And that's what I think is really interesting too. I referenced it previously is we have to kind of work in the constructs of psychiatry that we're currently in. But I think the more we can understand about these different diagnoses or constructs or symptomologies and collections of symptomologies and collections of behavior that we're tracking here in the study, maybe this can help us get a better understanding of really how are these different behavioral anomalies manifesting? Does it always relate to a specific disorder? Are there other patterns that we're seeing in just behavior and mental health broadly that can help us redefine these constructs better? Understand what we're calling X, Y, and Z, or understand do we need to call it X, Y, and Z if we know these are the behavioral patterns that we're seeing and we don't need to put them into these buckets. So I think that's another benefit of studies like this. While we have to stay in the domain and kind of go build off the shoulders of giants, we have the opportunity to really expand into a space that is previously undiscovered. It's kind of a new frontier, which is data and wearable sensors and biobehavioral tracking in real time, which I think gives us a lot of leveraging for what we can understand and what we can learn. Just like tracking your EDA on your smartwatch, it brings you to these new kind of unknowns of what does this mean? What can I do with this? When can I track this?
It was definitely better than back in the day when I was a child and I would have to just sit with a psychiatric person for 5 minutes and I got a diagnosis like that, and it was, you can't tell that about a child within 5 minutes. It's unspeakable.
Right.
And then they would just give you medicine.
Right.
You know?
Right, exactly. And that's really nice is, kiddos can't explain their abstract emotions, but honestly, I have trouble explaining my abstract emotions sometimes. I think many people have trouble explaining their abstract emotions sometimes. So getting more objective measures on that for a population that, has shown to not be able to speak to their abstract emotions might help us other humans that are a little bit older and maybe still have trouble with that, identify patterns or expand this kind of screening or technology into adults as well of how can we track these different, behaviors when we can't speak to it specifically. So I think that's great and how it could revolutionize the field. Hence
Really good.
my intro. I think it has a lot of potential. Yeah.
So how did you decide on the objective measures? Is that from previous research that was done, or just your first, how did you decide which wearables and what things to track?
That's a great question. So a lot of it is based on previous research. A lot of it is based on physiology itself, what you intuit about sympathetic and parasympathetic response of different stress situations, how you would guess that would manifest on the body, what literature has shown on how stress manifests on the body. What's really tough is a lot of sensors right now are adapted from adults to kids. And so a lot of the sensor selection we had to do of just what works for a kiddo, putting the muscle sensor or putting any sort of sensor on their arm, we use something called a biostamp.
And unfortunately, sometimes that thing just falls right off. They've got such little tiny arms. And so that gives you another insight into the field is not only do we have not a lot of tracking, we don't have a lot of devices that can track. And so I think that's an opportunity as well. And that's part of how we decide which features we look at, which modalities, is just what's available for this population that's underserviced. Yeah. Amazing. And I'll reiterate again here, if you have any questions or you're feeling a little shy or you like to ruminate on it for a while and digest it and maybe want to read a thing and then send me an email, feel free to scan this QR code or take a picture of it or reach out to me or email me or go to my website. It's justmyname.com. And feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to meet with you or answer any other questions. Yeah, we've got one more here.
Yes. Which giant does your theory stand on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so right now, if you look at kind of the childhood mental health space and wearable sensor space, a lot of it is being pioneered by my lab and the labs that we're connected to. And so by standing on shoulders of giants, I'm standing on the shoulders of my advisors most every day. They're teaching me a lot, they're carrying me along. And so I think that's a really important thing for you all to consider too, is talking to other faculty members and your advisors, seeing what they're very curious about, and seeing how that differs from the field or why are they intrigued in that, because that's part of the reason why I'm so passionate, is they've showed me a space that, you know, I could really spread my wings in, and they've set the foundation for. That's a great question. Amazing. Anything else? Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a blast.